Just before my grandmother died, she said to my dad, "There's a blue suitcase in the attic, and when I'm gone, I want you to burn it." And after she passed away, my father was sorting her possessions, and sure enough, he comes across the suitcase. He opens it, and inside he finds letters, hundreds and hundreds of letters. 992 letters, to be exact. Apart from a few letters from my grandmother, the majority of the suitcase's contents are the letters that she received from my grandfather between August 1940 and February 1946. This being his time in the army during the Second World War. My dad thankfully didn't do as he was instructed and burn the suitcase. Even at a glance, it's clear that its contents is precious and must be preserved. He did not, however, have any desire to read them.
I didn't particularly want to read, and in fact, I never have read any of the contents. Because that is quite a personal thing for them, and for me it's almost an intrusion on their romance and their life, and being so close to them, I think it's something I still to this day couldn't do.
I felt at a more comfortable distance. The suitcase and its contents fascinated me. It came into my possession and is now in my flat in London. I wanted to read the letters, all of them, from start to finish. So, on opening the case and taking a closer look, I could see that initially there had been a good attempt to keep the letters in order, but over the years that order had been undone. Elastic bands that had been used to bind the envelopes into months had become brittle or simply just turned to dust. My first job was to get the envelopes back into order. This itself took a bit of time. But once it was achieved, it was time to start reading, and this was a job that at the start I greatly underestimated. There was just so many of them. And what you soon realise as you start to read is that you are living through a relationship, day by day, and in careful detail, between two young people who have been forced apart by war. The contents of the suitcase is a story, the very start of a story. It's a story that I had only known in its final chapters. I was there in the rooms where the stories ended. But the start of the story was a mystery to me. A mystery that now sat in a little blue suitcase in my front room. The story begins in 1940, with the Second World War not yet a year old, shortly after my grandparents meet while working at a Liverpool library. My grandfather is called up for service and leaves Liverpool, and in his very first letter, Arthur, that's my grandfather, writes back to Eileen, my grandmother, about his army medical and his enrolment into the forces. He is then posted to Derby for basic training and starts his military life as a rookie in the Royal Signals. But Arthur soon starts to crave the adventure of foreign deployment. In September 1941, he goes up to the board for the Royal Artillery and is accepted. Soon after, he becomes an officer in training. In 1941, he is posted to an anti-aircraft artillery position at Bristol. As war intensified, German air raids on English soil became a part of everyday life. Liverpool and Bristol, with their large ports, were cities that were hit with particular ferocity. Arthur would get leave to return to Liverpool once every month or two. The time in between these precious reunions were marked with their letters. They wrote every day. The letters were their only communication. They were falling in love and set about making their plans for the future. The home they would one day share, the child they will one day raise, a child they were already calling Jennifer. Arthur was converting to Catholicism so he could marry Eileen. Their future, regardless of war, was being manifested. As foreign deployment with the Royal Irish Artillery looked ever more a certainty, Arthur took a few days' leave over Christmas and returned to Liverpool, where he and Eileen, on December the 29th, 1942, were married. The next day, he returned to Bristol. Several months later, Arthur writes to tell Eileen he's to be posted overseas, and on the morning of October the 18th, 1943, Arthur leaves England for India. These are his dog tags, and this is his name and number. When I lay the letters out in chronological order, I could see that as Arthur departs for India, the letters suddenly stop. And then they pick up again. Here, there's a hole in the timeline. Military censors were ever vigilant, ensuring that no sensitive information was sent by mail. You can even see on several of Arthur's letters where prohibited words or information have been physically cut from the paper. So initially, Arthur could give no explanation for the drop in communication. Eileen just had to bear the silence and uncertainty. It wasn't until several months later that he could finally tell her what had happened. On his way to India, his troop convoy had been torpedoed and sunk. He ended up with hundreds of other British troops somewhere in the eastern Mediterranean. He had made it to one of the life rafts, and after a few hours in the water, was rescued by a passing American ship. He writes that the ocean was growing stormy during their rescue, and each man had to make a well-timed leap from the life raft as it pitched up and down some 20 feet on the water. Arthur was the last man to leave the raft, and by the time it was his turn to jump, the raft was unsteady and pitching up and down even higher on the waves. He made his leap at the apex of a rather ferocious swell and managed to fly straight over the heads of the men braced to catch him. Instead of landing in the safe arms of his rescuers, he was shot into the steel bulkhead of the ship and was knocked out cold. He woke up an hour later, a little worse for wear, but undoubtedly alive. After an undisclosed amount of time marooned in North Africa, the troops were assigned to a new transport, and then it was on to India. From a few clues I found in the letters, mentions of Karachi, Lahore and Lucknow, it seems that the first year of Arthur's time in India was spent at a number of postings around what is now the modern state of Pakistan and its borders with India. The letters fall back into their customary irregularity. Their written words become a lifeline. They both describe their daily routines, their little details. Eileen talks about work, who she takes lunch with, a visit to the movies to see Bette Davis and Now Voyager, the little dress she passes in a shop window on the way back from work that she dreams of affording. She keeps Arthur up to date with the family dramas, her family and his. She writes to Arthur from her little green room, as they refer to it, her bedroom at her parents' house. While writing, she is always wrapped in the dressing gown Arthur has left behind. After the nightly air raid, she would don a tin hat and set about putting out fires and clearing the debris. Then it was back to work at the library for 9 a.m. She describes a regular morning anxiety of watching the empty chairs of colleagues who were late for work. Sometimes they would finally arrive late. Sometimes they would not show up at all. She expresses to Arthur that she fears he will be irreversibly changed by his experiences at war. Anxieties triggered by a man at the post office who remarked as he was posting her letters, "He won't return from India the same man, you know." Arthur does his best to allay her fears, although he does warn her that he is losing the battle to keep hold of his hair, and gives her fair warning that he may be looking a little more middle-aged on his return. His letters detail the sights and sounds of the strange new country he finds himself in, the people, the heat, the rigid military routine, the football matches, the oceans of stars overhead at night as the moon illuminates the desert, all the time wishing Eileen was there to see it too. He pines for her, the simple things, walking hand in hand back from the pictures, her laugh, her kiss. All the while they talk of the future and a time when they will be returned safely to one another. The most arresting thing about these letters is their beauty. Firstly, the handwriting is immaculate. Secondly, the words and sentences are constructed with such love, care, and attention. Then there are Arthur's drawings, tiny little jewels to discover amongst the pages. The art of letter writing is certainly a lost one. Who takes time like this anymore? Who sits down for an hour to craft with love an intimate artifact such as this? We fire off emails, tweets and memes at the push of a button, all instantly lost and forgotten. These words are still here 80 years later. What's more, another intriguing aspect of this collection is that it only, for the most part, is telling half the story. In his letters, Arthur talks about his sadness at not being able to carry all of Eileen's letters along with him, particularly at times when his troop was more mobile. He agonises over having to burn most of the correspondence and retain a small number of his most treasured letters. Later, he resorts to posting his most precious letters back to Eileen for safekeeping. These are the ones that can be found in the suitcase, each one sealed with a kiss, her lipstick still present on the page. In one of these saved letters, Eileen marvels at the strength of their love for one another, a love that not even a world at war can extinguish. She writes, "Even after death, my darling, I can imagine it will live on." Maybe when being so close to her own death, Eileen saw the suitcase as being of no use to anyone anymore. It was better off being burnt. Maybe she was embarrassed by the words of her younger self, candid glimpses of a young woman and the anxieties and jealousies and insecurities that young lovers experience at one time or another. However, as a young woman, in the letters, Eileen does express a strong desire to have them preserved. She wanted others to read the beautifully written travelogues Arthur would send her, detailing his experiences as he travelled through India. She wanted to share his words and his pictures. Arthur's position seemed to constantly change, moving slowly eastward across India until in 1945 he found himself in the dense jungles of Burma, modern-day Myanmar. He was camped on the banks of a complex river delta with about 40 British, Indian and Gurkha troops. News came in that a large movement of Japanese troops would be passing their position in a matter of days. The colonel received orders that they were to hold their position and engage with the Japanese. He put Arthur in charge of the men and then set about to leave, leaving his dog Susan also in my granddad's care. Just before he left, he gave my granddad one final instruction. As soon as he received radio confirmation that the arrival of the Japanese troops was imminent, he was to shoot Susan with his service revolver. The subtext here was very clear. The Japanese outnumbered the men almost 10 to 1. He wouldn't see home again. He wouldn't get back to Eileen. The colonel left, and my granddad and the rest of the troops camped by the river's edge in the jungle, and waited. The next day, the radio message came through. My grandfather received it. 3 simple words: "Don't shoot Susan." In those 3 words, he knew that the Japanese had changed their course out of the Delta. They got to live another day. In this letter from Arthur, dated May 7th, 1945, you can see the exact point at which he is interrupted by a radio broadcast reporting that victory in Europe had been announced. Despite the jubilation back home as VE Day is declared the following day, for Arthur and the troops in India and Burma, the job was far from over. It wasn't until January the following year that Arthur received his movement orders and he began his journey back across India. On February 14th, 1946, Arthur set sail on the Empress of Australia on his 19-day sea voyage back home to England. This is the final letter. February 21st, 1946. Written at sea, 2 weeks ahead of his arrival in England. Getting to the final letter feels strange. It's taken me years to read them all. It has been comforting to hear the voices of my grandmother and my grandfather in my head again, to hear their words and their thoughts and their dreams. Arthur returned to Liverpool. He settled down with Eileen in the little flat that she had found for them. Arthur returned to civilian life. They set about making up for the years they had lost during the war. A child soon arrived. Not Jennifer, but Paul, my dad. Arthur and Eileen lived out the rest of their days together. And the letters? They are returned to the little blue suitcase, kept safe, treasured. Maybe they'll be passed on to my own children one day. Maybe one day they will be handed to their children. Maybe the case and its stories will be kept safe for another 80 years.